Good evening, everyone. I am Paul Brathwaite, and I am thrilled to be joining you all this evening. And we are excited about our Forever Learning Institute program. I want to welcome you all to our discussion tonight regarding our right to vote. And we are thrilled, and I am thrilled to be participating as your moderator for this evening. I welcome all the alumni and friends to this session, Alumni Forever Learning Institute, which is an interdisciplinary educational program organized in a set of thematic courses. As I said tonight, we are going to be talking about the right to vote. And joining us tonight are two experts who I think are going to give us a treat in terms of their perspectives on the topic. Kevin Porter, Associate Professor of Public Policy and Political Science and History. And our second panelist is Professor John Aldrich, who is the Pfizer Pratt University Professor of Political Science at Duke University. And I see Deondra on my screen, and I'm almost certain that Professor Aldrich will be joining us here shortly and will pop up as well. But good evening, Deondra. Good evening, John.
Good evening, Paul. Hello, everybody. Hi, John.
Hi, Deondra. Hello, Paul.
Welcome.
Everybody.
Well, I'm excited for this conversation tonight, and I want to jump right in it. You know, every Tuesday during the year, seemingly an election year, is an election year. And tonight we've got elections in New Hampshire, primary elections in New Hampshire. Which is usually the state we're all looking at when it's a presidential year because they get the first presidential primary. It's a little early for that, but they are in the spotlight tonight. But I'll just start off by asking both of you a general question, which is, what is your biggest concern around voting rights coming into this midterm election? We are now 50 some odd days away from Election Day 2021. November 8th is Election Day. And I would just like to get your perspective as what you've seen so far this year. And as we lead up into Election Day, what is your biggest concerns? And so, Deondra, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much for that great question. And hello, everyone. For me, I spend a lot of time thinking about democracy and thinking about the connection between education and information and democracy. So I spend a lot of time wondering to what extent in this political context with social media in sort of acting as a force in our political landscape that is constantly shaking things up and challenging many voters when it comes to the influx of incoming information and available information. I'm always curious about whether people can find accurate, reliable information enough that helps them to navigate our complex electoral process and electoral system. And so just for me, it's access to quality information and really understanding the rules of the game, because studies have shown that, especially for young voters, feeling a sense of unease or like potential confusion is one of the factors most likely to convince somebody to sit out an election and to not vote.
Those are strong points. Obviously, information is always going to be to make an informed vote. John, you want to give us your thoughts? What are your biggest concerns?
I certainly agree with what Deondra had to say. I would add two more things. One of them is that because so many people are questioning from various different perspectives the electoral system and beginning to, it seems like they're beginning to undermine trust in the ability of the system to perform as it's supposed to, and people to perform within that system in the way they're supposed to, that it's a very worrisome time for the integrity of the system from both sides. The second thing that I would like to note is that there's been so much change in the rules governing turnout, vote counting, and elections, induced in part by the need to adjust to the pandemic in 2020, that there's heightened uncertainty about what to do, number one, what the rules are, and how to adjust to them. And then number two, the parties, it seems it gets more attention on the Republican side, but maybe it may be on both sides, are getting so many people to participate in election observation and in attending around the polls and trying to become members of election commissions and that sort of thing, that there's such high uncertainty about this that lots of people are going to have to deal with in a way that we haven't had to deal with for most of our electorate's lifetime. And that's also worrying, even if it's benign in all cases. So both malignant and benign reasons to be worried about the induction of so much uncertainty into the electorate.
Yeah, and the uncertainty is definitely palatable, and I think many people sort of feel that. I'd be curious, you just mentioned the rules governing the elections. I think most folks didn't know, and probably maybe are now becoming more aware that secretaries of states in our respective states have an important role in a vital role in the administration of elections, the rules that you talked about. Today we don't really have an election day. We have early voting in some states, not others. They're weekend voting in some states, not others. Give me your take, both of you. Give me your take on your views on access to voting. Should election day be a holiday? Should we set a standard? Should there be a voter? I'm asking 2 3-part questions here, but what are voter bill of rights? Should there be a voter bill of rights? I mean, should I be able to go to the ballot box and say, an hour is the most that anyone should stand in line for voting? But talk a little bit about who administers elections and why those positions are important, and then speak a little bit about how would we make it more accessible for voters, and what sort of rights should a voter have in terms of access to the ballot? John, you want to start this time?
Okay, sure, thanks. Yeah, excellent questions. If I can keep them all together in my head, this is great. So first, the actual running of elections is in most places county level electoral boards, electoral commissions. And they have typically been ordinary citizens who volunteer to spend a lot of time working out the details of implementation. As the population changes, things have to be done about the location of voting sites. Very specific details that make a lot of difference to people. And those are generally at a local level. In most places, you can't generalize to 50 states in the district, but in most places it's county level commission. So at a relatively low level, as you mentioned, most states use secretaries of state as the people to write the larger policy that governs voting in their states. And as we have been unable to accomplish at the national level, there have been attempts to introduce reforms at the national level. So one of the places of uncertainty is there are so many levels at which rules can be enacted and implemented that's confusing by itself. One more thing is that we often think of the stuff at the local level, what county boards of elections are engaged in, as it's certainly nice to make sure there are enough people at the ballot box to hand out the ballot at the precinct to hand out ballots and help people know how to fill them out and submit them and so forth. But that's also the place at which especially younger and especially poorer voters and senior senior voters that's the place where the, rubber hits the road, and they get confused. They don't know what to do. They have much more learning to do than other people because it's new to them, for the younger voters and so forth. And so this, a social psychologist who used to be at Duke named Wendy Wood, and she and I had worked together in some papers. She just published one, and she calls that the friction of the system. You move a precinct, polling place, and people, it takes time and effort to figure out where to go. You change the rules about absentee voting, and you don't know whether you can apply or not, whether you have done it right. And so forth. And this friction is the largest source of uncertainty in the part of voters. They did surveys and they did experiments, and that's the largest source of uncertainty on the part that leads to abstention. People just sort of say, I'm confused, I'm packing it in.
I would absolutely echo all of that, John. And I would add, to your question, Paul, this idea of a voter's Bill of Rights, I find intriguing. And, just to step back and think really in terms of the big picture here, if we proclaim and profess to be a democratic form of government, this idea that every citizen who is eligible and of age can vote and can find his, her, or their way to the polls without too much friction or trouble is essential to our form of government. And of course, we all know that that's not necessarily the case. I mean, in 2020, we actually saw some interesting increases in voter turnout, which I think was somewhat surprising to many who were concerned about what the pandemic would lead to in terms of the ability to participate. But one of the interesting forces, I think, or drivers of that change was the fact that in the midst of the pandemic, we were being a little more flexible across the board than historically we have. So the incorporation of early voting, vote by mail, these mechanisms to facilitate voting to a greater degree, I think is essential. And it really showed that when we provide people with multiple pathways to the polls, it pays off in terms of participation. I think, Paul, if we were to continue moving down that direction or down that path to something like an election day holiday, to I'm trying to think of other reforms. My students love this, I have to say. Like, students here at Duke love thinking big about what voting could look like. It's interesting because they point out that many of the inefficiencies that we continue to talk about and grapple with, they almost remind you of just some of the broader inefficiencies of government. And if we think about that as having some sort of feedback effect on people's impressions of government, the fact that you might have to go and line up for hours at a time just to cast a vote, or that you can't figure out what your polling place is because you moved and you're grappling with the various rules for registration. I mean, I think for many of us, that represents one of our primary sort of occasions to interact with government and politics. And so I think the nature of that experience has really important bearing on democracy and people's willingness and interest in engaging, willingness to and interest in engaging. So I love this question. I think that all of us as citizens within a democracy should be asking this question: what does a voter Bill of Rights look like? What could it look like? And we should be pushing mechanisms to get there. If it's ballot initiatives, whatever it is. And Paul, I know you've talked about those. I think we should actually be thinking really big. We have to at this moment.
May I just add a couple
Of course, please.
Most countries around the world, certainly the ones we compare ourselves with, do registration. The government is responsible for ensuring that the voters are registered. We have, since the beginning of voter registration, which was late in the 19th century, have put the onus on the individual to ensure that they get themselves registered, instead of the other way around. It's, we have an opt-in system instead of an opt-out system, the way most other nations do. That's one of the most substantial reasons for why our turnout rates are so much lower than in other nations that we compare ourselves to. Almost all but Switzerland. The the second thing is, and I do also like the Bill of Rights of the but it should be, not to sound too much like Bill Clinton about abortion here, but it should be easy, safe, and I use the word clean for voters to be able to cast the vote. Every single voter who is eligible by the rules should have a as easy and a method of voting. And on the other side, to make sure that by the clean, I mean they cast one vote and only one vote. But those two together, and that works much better if it's done through the government taking charge to make sure it happens, with citizens monitoring the application of the rules, than the reverse of voters making sure it happens with government making monitoring for the rules.
I agree. Yes. Look, I want to get to this role of citizens, because it is our fellow Americans who are actually administering our elections. And we have, for a large part of the system, is reliant on volunteers. These are not paid people who show up on election day or early voting and take your ballot and show you how to do it. They're volunteering. They're usually chosen by their political parties to do that. But we have seen through the last election and even into some of the elections this year, election workers being intimidated or threatened. And if we lose people who essentially either are doing their jobs because, yes, this is what they do for the county or for the state in terms of election administration, or they are the larger group of our fellow American citizens who enjoy being a part of the process, giving you that sticker that we wear on our lapels saying, I voted. Those are all volunteers. And so talk a little bit about election workers and maybe for our fellow alumni and friends who are listening, your thoughts around, how we get more people involved in the system versus this sort of, this sort of looming threat over the folks who administer elections and volunteer for elections.
Maybe I'll jump in just to get us started on this. I don't think that we can understate the value and importance of citizens who engage at such a high level. I think in this day and age, and we see this as we've been talking about, participating in politics is not entirely fashionable, like not in the way that we would hope. I think, most people, I think the form of engagement that is least labor intensive and demanding, of course, is voting. But as you advance up the tier of modes of political engagement, we absolutely do see people trickle down. And so I think, again, the engagement of people who are willing to come out and do some of the more intensive democracy work, I mean, I think they're stalwart and must be protected. I'd say the same thing for public servants, people who actually put themselves out there to be participants in democracy, to actually do policy work. And I think there's so much mistrust of politicians right now, and rightfully so. There are many reasons to be frustrated with the way our government is working or not working. At the same time, I think, the rhetoric about politicians and just some general sentiment about those who engage in political activities leaves much to be desired. So I just, to start off, to cast a major vote and maybe a little bit of a love note to people who do participate in that way, because I think they're really central to our democracy.
Following on that, before the partisan polarization began to be, a major feature of our political life, it was very common for voting to be sort of a community event. You go there and the workers would be your neighbors, and quite often they were senior citizens, because there's somebody who has, if they're retired, they have the time, because on a Tuesday, if we made it a holiday or put it on a weekend like most nations, it would be more people would be find it easier to become election workers. But it would be greet your neighbors. There was a famous study in political science, and it happened to be in Connecticut, but the political scientists noted that a fair number of precincts had bake sales at them, and there was much higher turnout because it indicated that it was sort of a social thing, and you go out and hang out with your neighbors, you cast a vote, you get some baked goods, chat things up, and it was a positive communitarian kind of context. It's hard to imagine we can return to that, although that it wasn't, for someone of my age, it didn't seem that long ago. It was in the 1980s. It wasn't that long ago, but it's still a long time ago. I don't know we could ever recapture that, but it is one of the prices of partisan polarization in our political climate.
Could I tag on one thought there, John? I love that idea. And I have to say, I even think about how campaigning has changed over the years. And I feel like even just that sort of community feel, the idea that someone will come to your house and knock on your door and talk to me. I mean, you all should come and connect with students and hear some of their sentiments about that style of campaigning. I think that we're in an era where, as we've seen, people they don't only phone bank now, they do text banking as well. There are all these mechanisms for creating engagements that aren't the same kind of retail person to person that we're traditionally used to. And I think it signals some important shifts in our democracy and things that John, you're right to emphasize, because I think those are really crucial changes.
Thanks, Deondra, and thanks, John. I love the, voting as a community event. And, and by the way, I made up the voting Bill of Rights as we were just talking here, but it just seems to me that, if we gave people, much like we have our Bill of Rights in our Constitution, if we gave people a feel like you are guaranteed these 5-10 things, and if you meet these requirements, I think people would probably feel more empowered. I did a little bit of research on which states have done the best in terms of voter participation. Minnesota and New Jersey are at the top with 80%, voter participation. That's a high watermark. No one's in the 90% range, but we have seen, and I'd love to get you all's view. We've seen some states move to all mail-in voting. Colorado, for instance, is all mail-in voting. Some other states are moving to that. Again, giving people the power to do it at home, put it in an envelope, take it to your polling office and drop it off. I think anything that makes people participate more in the process, you then get a true reflective of what the electorate feels. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts around mail-in voting and how versus in-person voting? I myself like to go to the polling station, stand in line, cast my ballot, and feel like I've participated and done sort of my civic duty. I go to the mailbox to sort of drop off bills, and yes, I sometimes still drop off my bills in the mail. I do pay some online, but normally I drop them off sometimes I drop them off in the mail. But I'm curious, John and Deondra, thoughts around more voter participation.
The mail-in voting, which has been in Wisconsin and Oregon now for long enough that been able to study it to some reasonable extent, has increased participation. That's true. It has also, as you point out, reduced the time you interact, since you just it comes in the mail. In those states, you put it back in a stamp self-addressed envelope, just like the old days. You can also take it, downtown, but because it comes to you, this is closer to the opt-out than opt-in. That is, you have to choose not to fill it out and turn it back. That's the principal reason, I believe, that the turnout has increased in those places. It hasn't changed. As it happens, it hasn't changed very much. Class, race, age, gender differences in turnout. Those persist. So there's something more than that, but that would need to be done if we were going to try to really get towards as close as we can to 100% participation in elections.
Here. The only thing I would add to that is to say, I'm like you, Paul. I like to go to the polls. I like to stand there. I like to be awkward and smile at the person next to me. I just think the social experience of voting to me is thrilling. I can think of other people, good friends who hate the extra chore in their day and they want this to be fast. They much rather submit a ballot by mail. So, part of me thinks that for people who are just, true blue lovers of politics, that maybe there's something about that social aspect. But the idea that we're offering multiple pathways to vote, I think is really important.
If I could get a cupcake before I go to vote, that's fine.
I'll get us cupcakes next time.
So, yes, your little treat would entice lots of people. I want to talk about ballot initiatives, and then I want to get to the 2020 election and talk a little bit about that. And then I want to come back to 2022. Now, I didn't start with 2020 because I didn't want us to dwell there and only talk about that. But I want to talk about ballot initiatives and citizens going and getting gathering signatures and putting initiatives on the ballot. We've seen that in a number of states. Again, it's civic participation. Different state constitutions allow for citizens to put questions on the ballot regarding taxes, regarding abortion, regarding the right to vote, the restoration of the right to vote, like they did in Florida. In your research, either of you that you've done around ballot initiatives, speak a little bit about that. And again, another way of citizens engaging in the process.
This answer is not rooted in my research. But as someone who broadly does research on democracy and political engagement, to my mind, ballot initiatives are democratic. This idea that we're offering citizens an additional pathway or additional mechanism to express their preferences in a system where there's gridlock and polarization that has held up the business in Washington, I think it's absolutely, we're just seeing citizens maneuver and try to circumvent an institutional structure federally that's not working. And so I don't think it's surprising that we're starting to see so many ballot initiatives pop up right now. And I think, as you mentioned, Paul, especially at this particular moment, initiatives on abortion, contraception, I think marijuana legalization we're seeing on the ballots in some states. Those are issues where citizens have really strong perspectives. They expect to see some change. They want to see something done. And their other avenues for engagement and pursuing policy change have been held up. So I'm actually quite bullish about ballot initiatives and really fascinated by the mechanism.
So there are different kinds. That is, there are genuine citizen initiative-led proposals that you can get put on the ballot in places like California, which is probably pretty much at the extreme of having ballot propositions as a regular feature of their politics. Sometimes they come from citizens. That often means they're interest group organized, for good or ill. And so that's one source. Another source is the state assembly legislature can put ballots on the ballot, or propositions on the ballot, sorry. And they often do that for things where they would rather not cast the vote, but let it go directly to the citizens. And in some ways, those are more interesting than even the citizen initiatives. And then there are some that are just sort of required by law for constitutional amendments to many state constitutions have to be on a ballot for voting. It used to be that most states had the school budget was directly voted on by the public. In many places, I participated in those elections too. That's as close as I think that's as close to direct democracy as you could reasonably imagine, because it's your school district that you're voting on your taxes about, or for their schools. It's something that, you know, parents really care about, and lots of people really care about. So it seems to me that's a place where voting on the proposition is a really good instance of sort of direct democracy, where it's nice to be able to skip out of the city council or the state legislature, or however the taxes would otherwise be assigned.
Could I mention one thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about? Like when I encounter ballot initiatives, I'm always curious about the wording and just wondering, you know, if they are truly accessible to people who maybe haven't been paying as close attention to the process, you know, in the weeks or months leading up to the election. So I think that's also something, you know, that I think about. I spend a lot of time thinking about just informationally, again, whether voters who are engaging with this opportunity to be a part of something that's closer to direct democracy really have the tools they need to weigh in effectively.
So one couple of my closer friends in political science have studied this in California, and it turned out that people used what groups or other you know, prominent individuals and so forth endorsed or opposed the proposition as the principal determinant of whether they supported or opposed it themselves. So I'm not quite sure how you want to make of it. You know, they refer to that as shortcuts, informational shortcuts, to be able to decide whether some complicated, you know, amendment to the bill about auto insurance, you know, very complicated issue that you can't fit into something kind of small. That you could look at. It would take a lot of work to learn, but if you found out that AAA is in favor of it, but something else is not, you know, you would know how to vote on it.
Right. I want to talk about the 2020 election, but I want to talk about it in this way. And that is, again, people didn't realize we had a law called the Electoral Count Act, where Congress has a set of rules that it uses to count the electoral college votes of each respective state. And there's a process for challenging electoral votes from respective states. There has been an effort or a few efforts here in Washington, where I am on Capitol Hill, to look at whether or not that act needs to be updated such that the role of the vice president, the role that individual legislators in either the House or the Senate may take should be revamped and updated to sort of the point in time of where we are. What are you all's thoughts around the counting in the presidential sense? This is only the Electoral College only impacts the presidential election. We don't have a popular vote only election. It depends on the states you win, as everyone most likely knows on this Zoom. So thoughts around revamping and revising the Electoral Count Act as we go into 2024, where I don't think it's in anyone's best interest to have our courts being the deciding voices. If it comes to that, that is what it is. But I don't think anyone wants, you know, our courts to decide elections when we do put the power in the hands of the American people in their respective states.
I'll start off with this. So if I were from the law school, I'd be saying right now, bad cases make bad law. It was one of the worst elections we've had, the 1876 election, that led to the end of Reconstruction and so forth. That also led to this law because of contended electoral college, victories in individual states, and a formed this sort of strange commission to work out a deal that basically got Hayes elected over Tilden and led to the end of Reconstruction and then to this law. It's just a bad case, and the law is therefore bad because it's written to deal with the most extreme case we've had in this respect in the country until then. So I'm in favor of revising that law for that reason, so that it's geared to the elections we normally encounter as well as the extreme ones. We need to be able to, when there's a problem, we need to be able to have something to go back to. It's my understanding, it hasn't happened, but it's my understanding there's a relatively good chance that a bipartisan version of the bill would be able to be introduced and presumptively passed. And if it's bipartisan, it's a much better electoral, has a chance of being a much better electoral law than if it's one party or the other.
And I think John's answer is perfection. The only thing I would add is that I think it's really important that we get this right. I think that we're at a moment, we've talked about this already, of considerable mistrust when it comes to American political institutions. And I think the electorate's sense that their votes are translating into meaningful election outcomes is critical to the health of our democracy. So if there's this sense that our system, our electoral college system and our system of electors is not working out in a way that's translating the will of the people into the electoral outcomes, I think that can be especially damaging.
I agree. Well, you all have been great in terms of the questions that I have posed to you, but in looking at the chat, there have been a number of questions that have come in, and we want to get to some of the questions that have been asked. But why don't we start with this one that I see, which comes from Joseph Reeves, and it asks, how do we change from an opt-in to an opt-out system for voting to maximize voter participation while ensuring that only eligible voters are registered? And I will, yes, so I'll pause there and just ask, going to an opt-in versus an opt-out?
Other way around, I hope. We want to go to an opt-out. That is, we want the government to send, so a vote by mail, you could, use the census to determine who the set of eligible people are, plus whoever becomes eligible year by year, and then send a registration form to them so they have the registration. If you do a vote by mail, you send them the ballot, and so that's all opt out because you get it, and you would have to choose not to agree to be registered. You have to choose not to agree to return the vote, the ballot itself. So that's the easiest way of doing it. There are many ways of doing it. One of the things that stood in the way of this in earlier times when it was raised was that the easiest way people thought of it back then was that the national government develop a national ID card that you would use for voting, and libertarian views found that really difficult. Feeling difficult to swallow, and that set that aside. But there are a whole variety of ways, and we could just look at other nations, particularly ones like Canada, where the Dominion-wide voting is important, but provincial voting is, if anything, even more important than every equivalent of states. So we could have a decentralized federal system with opt-in, opt-out. Sorry.
And I love this question because I think it really points to this broader issue of the responsibilities of citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen in a territory? Oftentimes we talk about the perks of citizenship, or the rights associated with it. But, often I think in this case, we're talking about responsibilities of citizenship. And so I have to say our students they love talking about this type of question, like whether we should make voting the norm, and of course leave some avenue for people to say, you know what, I intend to not participate, I prefer not to, but to again make the standard some sort of engagement with that electoral process, the way we engage with the tax system, for example. Like there's so many places where we actually don't get that same level of choice. We have a responsibility, and we do it. So I think I love, again, this kind of thinking big about our electoral institutions.
Yeah, one of the things about, I should point that people will opt out, even in registration, if they're given the chance, because often voter registration rolls as a source of jury duty, and people find that more burdensome on average than casting a vote.
Now, someone just put in the chat that in New Jersey, and this may explain why they have high voter participation, when a person turns 18 years or older, according to Princess Hoagland, and applies for a driver's license, they have to opt out if they do not want to be registered to vote. So it seems as though New Jersey sort of automatically registers you. And I think this year they've actually had the highest in 2022 in terms of the primaries. They've had the highest voter participation rate, and there may be a correlation there in terms of their high voter participation. There was another question I wanted to quickly get your views on. I mean, and I'll give it this analogy. Pre-COVID, we probably wouldn't have had a video chat like this with 100 of our closest friends from all across the country and world being able to participate. At the same rate, the question becomes, is there a way to apply technology such that it would make it easier for people to vote? Someone pointed out that in 2020 was the first year that census forms were accepted online. Is there a way to accept voting online or use technology to allow people to vote? Could you vote from your iPhone? Could you vote from your laptop and securely do so? I think is what the question is going on. And are there limits to that that you all see, or if you have any general thoughts around it?
I'm of an age where this technology leaves me uncertain as to whether I can answer that appropriately. But I will say that in light of the 2000 election, Gore and Bush, that was so complicated in its handling as well, Caltech and MIT put together a team that is still active, that was computer science people and other STEM people, political scientists, historians, and others, and have developed proposals that address these issues. It's a shift. The real problem is it shifts every, maybe the iPhone 14 now is going to be different than, the iPhone 13. Who knows, right? So the technology moves very rapidly, and so you need to keep this up. But the idea that probably our two most prestigious technical universities are on the case is at least encouraging that there is an opportunity to take advantage of it.
Someone commented that in Canada they can vote by email.
I mean, that's definitely the future, right? I mean, I think what makes me nervous also is that if and when we shift to this new, more technologically integrated style of voting, it means that we'd also need to make sure that there's equity in who has access to devices and internet access. So, of course, we talk a lot about the landscape where even broadband access is inequitable. So, I think that's one of the bigger challenges, is also taking into account some of the ancillary or additional needs that we would have if we were to really pursue these types of innovations.
I want to come closer to home. Someone put in the chat a question about the independent legislature theory, which is there is a case that's going to be argued before the Supreme Court that comes out of a North Carolina challenge, basically saying that state courts don't have a say or shouldn't have a say on essentially the rules of voting, even if it's contrary to the state's constitution. It's been a theory that's been advanced and could be a precursor to a legislature picking electors or essentially counting some votes and not counting other votes, and having the final say based on the Constitution, giving power to states to administer their elections. We have the Constitution gives states and through their state legislatures the ability to set the rules of voting. So any comments around or thoughts around the independent legislature theory?
You're certainly at the edge of my expertise, but the presumption of judicial review that John Marshall established in 1801 or whatever it was applies to at least most, if not all, state constitutions, and it's pretty unlikely that the courts would give up that power. It would require an explicit, probably constitutional amendment to state constitutions, not necessarily to the US Constitution,
Right.
to be able to implement that. Now, of course, many states have relatively easier amending powers to their constitutions and certainly at the national level. So it may be able to happen. So, but I think that the principle of judicial review filtered down to the states and would require explicit statement. It doesn't apply. It doesn't apply here in this set of circumstances to make that a sustainable legal challenge. On the other hand, I am not a lawyer and a constitutional lawyer, and I think that's correct, but I'm not 100% positive.
And so I think we were talking about Moore versus Harper, and to my mind, just like John, I'm also not a lawyer. As someone who thinks a lot about institutions, and oftentimes that this recognizing that in our contemporary political landscape, we see political combat by a variety of means. And so, to my mind, this kind of really bold attempt to tie the hands of some of our institutions, I think to imagine that this is not political or that it's I think that's it would be disingenuous to imagine that this is a harmless change and something that wouldn't have, I think, really important political repercussions, institutional repercussions, democratic repercussions. So I think it's something, as you mentioned earlier, or as the wonderful questioner mentioned earlier, that North Carolinians are paying attention to, as are others in different states. So I would keep an eye on Moore versus Harper.
Thanks, Deondra. I want to see if we can end on a hopeful note, and that is in the 2020 election, about 55 million people voted in that election, but 80 million people didn't. I would be interested in your views as to how we can get those 80 million people more engaged. I know you don't have a wand and you can't wave it. And I know we've talked about misinformation and disinformation. We touched a little bit on the barriers to voting by maybe perhaps people not having enough time or the day off or what have you to go vote on at a set time and day. Because of family responsibilities and the like, but is there guidance for us, all of us as interested in the civic life of our country? And someone else put in the chat that said, look, a democracy is probably the best frame of government that the world has ever known, and I'm not sure what else we would move to if we moved away from this. I caught that there was probably some back and forth, but I agree with that sentiment. But a democracy only works if it's inclusive and involves everyone. So positive thoughts, John and Deondra, on how we get more people involved in the political process across the board.
This is what we spend all of our time thinking about at here at Duke at Polis, the Center for Politics, which John and I are both engaged in. Paul, you're engaged and you've helped us out. I'm sure many of our wonderful alums here have been tapped for comments and panel participation from Polis. And we really spend our time thinking about how to help Duke students, young people, to see democracy and public service as a possible vocation and something they want to engage in over the long term. I think one of the biggest sources of frustration that we see here on campus is students who feel like their votes don't matter. And I think in a system where we see, because of how districts are drawn, we see that for many who, regardless of where you live, a primary might be really the only show in town. And once the primary election is over, there's really no action in the general because, the district is drawn in such a way to where it really won't matter. Or even this idea that for so many people in this single member district system, it's hard to find potential representatives who maybe represent a citizen's preferences. And so oftentimes there's just a lot of frustration about the institutions, about the choices that we have, about the gridlock and the lack of progress on addressing these really pressing challenges that we're dealing with. So if you look at what voters care about, these issues, the economy, gun violence, abortion, and reproductive rights. I mean, there are so many, education, I can go on, immigration, there's so many issues that are critical right now where we're not seeing movement. And so I think a long-winded way of saying, creating some institutional changes and fixes that will actually clean some of that up is going to be essential to helping to bring people into democratic engagement. And I think, promoting a lifelong democratic engagement.
To the comment that was just up, ranked choice voting might help. It won't hurt, it might help. So I think we know what we need to do. The question is how to do it. Reducing the friction, as Wendy Wood, my former colleague and good friend, said, defined it, to make it as reduce the burden as close to zero as possible to actually the act of casting the ballot. I've obviously been pushing opt out versus opt in as a mechanism. We also need to develop, in addition to everything that Deondra said, which is all of which I fully agree with, we also need a system by which everyone can actually believe, has good reason to believe that their vote was counted. There was a remarkably large number of people, at least according to surveys, who in 2020 believed their vote was not counted, which is different from some of the other claims about the 2020 election. The way to do that, it seems to me there's two things. One of them, we need some kind of bipartisan, nonpartisan, credible institution that manages elections. And this is related to the second part, which is, when they wrote the Constitution, they didn't have any models to go by as to what would happen. And they said, oh, okay, Congress, you're in charge of your own elections. Today, that seems like a ridiculous self-interested empowerment. And we would do that differently if we could do it differently. And that's a lot of it. And indeed, most other nations said, "Oh, that worked okay, except for the gerrymander stuff. Well, we'll do it differently." And we haven't figured out a way to reflect all the learning that has gone on from the stuff that we have started ourselves in 1787.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Deondra, for just a wonderful, wonderful discussion tonight. And thank you to all of our participants, our alumni and friends for joining us and engaging. Bye, everybody. Thank you.